Welcome to Understanding Islam. This is the last in the series, Bearers of the Final Message, and we're going to look today at the contemporary world, the situation of Muslims and Islam around the world. Now, the problem with calling anything contemporary is that it's always changed by tomorrow. So we're just going to take a snapshot of some of the things that are going on in Muslim affairs around the world today. The other thing to remember is that today never begins today. It always begins yesterday, last year, and therefore we're going to look at the build-up to the situation that we have today because we need to understand the present in the light of the past. If we go back to the 16th century, to the rise of the age of the European age of discovery, when the European sea powers were going out, exploring the world through trade, through conquest, putting their mark on many different countries around the world, we can see that at this time a great deal of Muslim nations around the world come under the influence of the European powers, come under their control, trade, and indeed direct rule. This begins to mark the end of the golden period of the Muslim empires. This develops over a period of time into European colonization, the colonial period. Now, colonialism doesn't just rob people of their natural wealth, of their resources, of their independence, but it also robs people of their sense of self-worth, their self-respect. How can it be that our culture is superior to theirs when they are here ruling our country? It also tends to rob those societies of their intellectual elite, because the best and brightest want to go off and become like the European colonial masters, either to join the civil service, to run the country in the future, or just to simply ape the European colonial way of life. So you tend to get a reduction in the vitality of Islamic scholarship during this period. Now, there are various hallmarks along the way in terms of European colonization. One we can take is 1857. 1857 is the first war of independence in India, or the Indian Mutiny, as the British call it. And the British put it down with main force. Now, this marks the end of Mughal rule in India, and the Mughal emperor is indeed sent into exile in 1858, sent to Burma. And we see 4 different reactions taking place in India at this time. And these 4 reactions become typical for what is happening in the modern world in relationship to Islam and society. The first of these 4 reactions was that people kept alive the traditional practices, often in villages. The second reaction was to say, we must embrace modernity, and everything that is good in the European tradition and way of life, actually we must bring it into the life and culture and thought of Islam. The third tendency was to say we must keep away from the European colonial rulers, their ways of life, their money, their influence. We must dig deep into our Islamic resources. We must become better Muslims. We must become better educated Muslims. And eventually, when the European powers go, we will then be in a position to take over. And the fourth tendency was to say, you will never have real Islam until you have political power. So that Islam requires an Islamic state in order for there to be a truly Islamic way of life. And so we get the rise of what is called political Islam. If we look first at this tendency toward modernity or toward liberalism, as it's sometimes called, we see this in 19th century Egypt. After the French arrived in Egypt in 1798, you get a movement that the elite of Egyptian society wants to embrace French language, French culture, French education, a French way of life, a constitution, a legal system. And everything French becomes the milieu of the ruling classes during the 19th century. Of course, 95% of the people of Egypt of this time were illiterate in any language. So this movement to liberalism was really just affecting the upper class, the elite within society. A similar sort of movement we can see going on in India after the Indian Mutiny, when Syed Ahmed Khan, for example, wanted to embrace all that was good in English life and culture. He went on a visit to England in 1869, 1870, and then brought back the idea of changing the educational system within India so that it would model the English, the European way of education. And he established then the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, as he called it, in Aligarh in India. Today it's Aligarh University. And Syed Ahmed Khan wanted to embrace all the advances of European life and culture, to reinterpret Islam in naturalistic ways, and to show to the British rulers of India of that time that they had nothing to fear from intelligent, educated Islam. If we go back into the 19th century, the dominant Muslim empire of the time was the Ottoman Empire, based in Turkey with its capital in Constantinople, Istanbul. Now, the Ottomans sided with the Germans in the 1914-18 war, and we need to take up the story then, because with the fall of the Ottomans during that period, the European powers began to take control of the Middle East. And we see the British at this time making multiple promises to multiple people, and contradictory promises at that. So we have them on the one time urging the Arab leaders to rise up and overthrow the Ottomans, and promising them that they would then have self-determination. We see them promising the holy places to two quite different groups, to the Hashemites on the one hand and to the House of Ibn Saud on the other hand. And at the same time, we have another stream going on here, and that is from 1917, Lord Balfour, on behalf of the British government, is promising the Zionist movement that it is minded to support the creation of a Jewish state in the land of Palestine. That's the bit of the sentence everybody remembers. But of course the sentence went on to say, provided that it is clearly understood that the civil and religious rights of the people already living in Palestine is respected and in no way affected. Of course, that part of the sentence has conveniently been forgotten in much of history. Now, at the end of the 1914-18 war, a Frenchman and a British man sat down and decided to carve up the map of the Middle East and to create the modern countries that we know of today. They were Sykes and Picot, and literally they sat down with a map and a ruler and a pencil. They carved up Greater Syria, for example, into the 4 contemporary countries of Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. They drew the map of Iraq. They created different areas of influence between the French and the British through into history after that time. And so to understand what's going on in the modern Middle East, we need to understand the impact of the European powers in the early part of the 20th century. Now, not surprisingly, after the end of the war, the Egyptians, for example, wanted to rise up. They had a movement for independence, and they got a sort of limited autocracy within British rule going through into the 1940s. By 1948, we find the creation of the State of Palestine and the Arab War against the State of Israel. And once that war has been lost with the defeat of the combined Arab forces, then we see that a distinct change begins to take place. And people begin to realize that this sort of movement is not going to take them forward. What they need is complete independence, complete autonomy from the European powers. So we see one movement going toward Arab nationalism, and we associate this 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser takes power in Egypt. 1956, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, so that we can now see an assertion of independent Egyptian power and authority in their own land over the French and the British. And of course we know that that goes on into a series of military rulers in Egypt. After Nasser came Sadat, Mubarak, and of course we're just now coming into the new era of President al-Sisi. So we can see this move toward military hard men within the Arab Middle East. We can see that in Libya with Gaddafi, in Syria with al-Assad, and of course in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. So this is one trend that comes into this period. And indeed, one of the movements that this Nasserite theory brought in was to say we should reunite the Arabs of the Middle East into what was called the United Arab Republics. 1958, it only lasted 3 years, to 1961, but at that time we were used to seeing Egypt, UAR, Syria, UAR, United Arab Republic. And so this movement, this yearning for Arab self-identity, has been an important part of the modern period. Another movement was to say Islam is the answer. In other words, we need to return to a much more Islamic way of life. And this becomes, of course, the movement of political Islam, which in Egypt is associated with the name of Hassan al-Banna, who created the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 and then died in 1948. Mirrored in Pakistan with the work of Maududi, who died in 1978, and of course in Turkey associated with the name of Said Nursi and his Nurçalek movement, who wanted to resist the compulsory secularization of Turkey that came in from 1924 onwards with the disbanding of the Ottoman Empire and with the movement under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk to have a secular society and to see Islam as being a burden that was holding back the development of that society. And Sayyid Nursi is a reaction against that. Sayyid Nursi dies in 1960. And so we can see then this rise of political Islam. What we need is an Islamic state, then we can bring in Islamic laws, then we can train people to live in a Muslim way. So the state will be the teacher of the people. After 1948, once we get the rise of Nasser and his regime in Egypt, we see that he starts to oppress the Muslim Brotherhood. They become more militant during this time, and so hundreds, indeed thousands, of followers and supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood are imprisoned, are tortured, are executed, including their great theoretician Sayyid Qutb, who is executed in 1966. Now this movement goes underground and it engages with people where they are in need, where they are suffering within society. And so the great strength of the Muslim Brotherhood was to serve people in need, in the hope, indeed in the expectation, that once there were free elections, then the people would remember them and they would vote for them. And indeed, of course, during the Morsi period in Egypt, this is what we saw. 1979 becomes a key year in understanding what's going on in the Muslim world at the present time, because it was in this year that Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty. And in so doing, many Arabs, many Muslims around the world believed that they had reneged on the promises to the Palestinian people, that they should have the right to re-inherit their land, to return to their own land, and therefore this was a betrayal of the Palestinian people. And this, of course, led 2 years later, in 1981, to the assassination of President Sadat as a kind of punishment for having made this gesture of peace with Israel. And one of those who was present on the military stand when Sadat was killed was, of course, the future President Mubarak, who was injured on that day, and it was he then who brought in another police state and iron rule in Egypt after this period. So that's the first element of 1979. The second element is the Iranian Revolution, because up until this time, those who had talked about reuniting religious and political power to create an Islamic state had really been theoreticians, sitting and dreaming visions, without any clear strategy for how it should come about. But here we see Ayatollah Khomeini returning from exile and bringing about an Islamic revolution, which was to reunite for the first time in the modern period Islamic religious and political power. And this then gave a tremendous fillip, a boost, to those who wanted to think about political Islam, because here it was being proved to be possible. The third thing that happens in 1979 is that the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And over the period of the next 10 years, international brigades of Muslims were formed in order to drive them out. Many Muslim men from different countries answered the call and went to the aid of the Afghan people to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. They were trained and they were armed by the Western powers who wanted to see the Soviets being driven out, and the whole thing was bankrolled by the newly rich Arab oil-producing nations. Remember that in 1973, the Arab oil-producing nations raised the price of oil dramatically. So this started to bring a flood of new wealth into those hands. And it was that new wealth that enabled the Muslim fighters in Afghanistan to succeed in driving out the Russians. Now, this is crucially important because, again, this is the first time in the modern period that we've got a Muslim army which is fighting in the name of Islam and succeeds in driving out the oppressor who was oppressing the people of Afghanistan. And not just any army, not just any oppressor, but this was the Red Army of the Soviet Union, and they were driven out by an ad hoc group of Muslim fighters. And so a change comes about in the thinking of some Muslim people where they say, we can do it. We do not need to be oppressed anymore. And so you've got these three things, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, and therefore the feeling of betrayal of the Palestinians, the Iranian Revolution, and the beginning of the successful Muslim movement against the Red Army in Afghanistan. And therefore a new spirit is beginning to enter into the thoughts of some Muslim leaders. We can see that same spirit going on in the way in which a lot of money from these oil-rich Arab nations has been used over the last 20 or 30 years to promote their form of Islam in other places around the world. We can see this in newly liberated countries from the Soviet period in the north of Europe and in Asia. We can see it in Africa and in Asia as well as in Europe and North America. So this money is being used to promote not just Islam, but a particular interpretation of Islam. In the same way, that money is being used to reinforce certain Muslim fighters. So we see the internationalization of conflict. So we can see international fighters engaged in Iraq and in Syria who are bankrolled from this oil wealth. Now, two things we should notice from the Arab Spring in this regard. First of all, in the 21st century, we have instant access to the internet. Many people around the world will have seen pictures that were taken by young Egyptians in Tahrir Square, literally holding up their smartphones, capturing video film and transmitting it instantly to the internet. This means that with modern technology, it's much more difficult to hide atrocities, oppression of people around the world, and therefore there is much more of a sense that we know about it and we must do something about it. This is combined with a second element, and that is the question of demographics. Because one of the things that has happened around the Muslim world over the last few decades is a rapid expansion in population. We can say as the general rule of thumb that something like 2/3 of all Muslims in the world today are aged under about 30. Now, if you are aged under about 30, then you are entering into starting families, having children, and therefore further expansion. We can see this if we just take the example of Pakistan, that Pakistan, when it's created in 1947, has a population of just less than 40 million people. And today Pakistan has a population of around 170 million people. So you can see rapid expansion, a very young population, and a population that doesn't have a great future. In many countries around the world, people living with not enough work to do, not enough money to generate an income to start a family. And therefore we can begin to understand why it is that we see so many people who are prepared to risk everything in order to escape and start a new life in Europe or North America. And so the incidence of people who are crossing the Mediterranean wanting to start a new life in Europe is a sign people who have nothing have got nothing to lose. And therefore, let's go and give it a chance. And we're going to see this whole development continuing in forthcoming years. Let's conclude by just summarizing some of the modern trends that we can see going on around the Muslim world. There is the question of what sort of structures are best suited to carry forward the way of Islam politically in the modern world. And we can see that in Egypt in the recent period. We can see that also in the long history of Pakistan since its creation, struggling, is this a homeland for Muslims, or is this in some way an Islamic state? Another trend is to see the separation of different religious communities. We can see this especially in the Middle East, when for hundreds of years Jews, Christians and Muslims lived side by side in the Ottoman lands of the Middle East. And in the latter part of the 20th century and in the 21st century, we're seeing much more segregation there. Jews being forced to leave their historic homes in Arab lands, and also we have seen Christians who've been forced to leave places in Iraq, in Syria, and in Palestine. So that we're seeing religious segregation in a way that was not there historically. There are several elements of the post-colonial period that have yet to be worked through. One of those is legal systems. You see, when the European political powers left, they wanted to leave behind them a code of law. And so basically what they did was to take a European code of law, give it a little flavouring of the local people and of Islam, and then impose that on that society. And so what we see going on in different countries is people saying, we want a law that reflects our view on the world, our religious and political ideals. And so we see this development. Who can help us to work out how to apply the Sharia appropriately in the 21st century? Another important element of the contemporary world is globalization. Globalization culturally, through the internet, through worldwide dispersal of music, for example, and of literature. The English language is now vastly the most used language around the world, but also globalization in terms of multinational companies, in terms of profits being made in one country, but actually being repatriated to another, so that the poor do the work and the rich reap the benefits. And this whole Americanization, it's sometimes called, or McDonaldization, where we can see that people are wanting to ape elements of American way of life. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't also important trends in the Muslim world, to see that the best of the technological, the cultural, the scientific developments that have been there in the Western world should be embraced and taken on too. But it's not a wholesale takeover. There has to be a sense in which one can take those bits that one wants, that are useful and according to the ways of Islam, but not have to take everything. And finally, one of the biggest problems, which is ongoing and causing many concerns in the Muslim world, is with the United Nations and the way in which it was set up. It privileges certain powers in its Security Council, and it seems to have very definite double standards. We see that many United Nations resolutions are passed about certain questions, like the Israel-Palestine question, like the free autonomy of the people of Kashmir to decide their own future, and nothing is done about them. And on the other hand, certain other resolutions are passed, and it seems that this is a mandate that we are bound to act on because it's international law. And so we see double standards in play in international law here, which means that people lose all confidence in these so-called international corporate bodies like the United Nations. So we're going to come through a period during which all these various elements around in different Muslim nations around the world have to resolve themselves. Some of them are not going to be resolved quickly or easily, and therefore the key thing is to try to understand the background and how we got to the modern world. What's its history? How did we get there? That concludes this Understanding Islam series. It just remains for me to remind you that all the programs can be seen on the Ahlul Bayt On Demand website, and all the articles for each program are available to be downloaded from my own website. I thank you very much for coming on this journey of understanding with me.